Now there are several reasons why the United States didn't win the war in Vietnam. One of them was that the war was bloody complicated. Or as one of the most notable commanders of the US troops in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, put it, "The longest war in our history, it was the most reported and most visible to the public, but the least understood." Now it was confusing on many levels, yet in this video we'll just take a look at the military side. So looking at the military factor, there were at least three that made Vietnam so confusing: no front lines, force composition, and military operations. So let's take a closer look. One of the first key factors was there was basically no front lines. In a regular war, like the First and the Second World War, you could look at the map and usually would get a basic idea of the situation. This didn't work in Vietnam at all. This is also reflected in maps printed about the Vietnam War. If you look at the World War or Korean War map, it has front lines, occupied territories, and the location of divisions. Now if you grab a map from the Vietnam War, it usually has marked areas of prolonged enemy activity or some cases territory occupied. But such areas are usually not really linked with each other. These issues were also reflected by adapted US doctrines, for instance the artillery fire doctrine. In conventional operations, the guns of a battery usually were positioned in a staggered line parallel to the infantry front line, 2,187 or 3,281 yards to the front. In Vietnam, the front was in all directions and was only 55 or 109 feet away. The solution was to position the guns on a fire base. The guns could thus fire in any direction. Now some might argue that on a strategic level the demilitarized zone and the Cambodian border were the front lines, but on the operational and tactical side there were none. This resulted in various problems. First, it was hard to figure out the current situation, which leads to the second, it was almost impossible to track progress. Because if you can't understand the situation of yesterday, you can't compare it with today neither. Thus it was also hard to set clear objectives that were measurable. The problem of comparing was not limited to the front lines. This was also a major problem with force composition. So let's look at force structure and size. First, force structure. The US forces were still rather similarly structured to World War II times. Note that for the rest of the video I will refer to the forces fighting the US as communist forces, which isn't really accurate, but else the video would probably take 5 minutes longer. These forces had a structure which was unfamiliar to US commanders and analysts. Now let's look at the communist forces a bit closer. These forces consist of 4 basic components: combat forces, which were rather conventional like infantry, armor, fire support, and technical service units; administrative service forces, which was military personnel of the North Vietnamese headquarters in South Vietnam. They were organized on various levels like region, district, province, etc. Irregulars, which were forces of guerrilla, self-defense and secret self-defense units that were usually part of the village and Hamlet communist organization. Guerrillas provided combat training, tax collection, propaganda, sabotage and protecting communist cadre. Self-defense forces stayed in the area but built fortification, defended the area and performed propaganda. Now the secret self-defense forces were units that operated in areas that were not under communist control and performed intelligence, sabotage and propaganda. And since this is clearly not complicated enough, there was also the politico-military infrastructure that can be described as the apparatus through which the communists controlled the entire effort in South Vietnam, including the military forces except the North Vietnamese divisions. And to put the cherry on top of this, they tended to mix those units together too. In short, if someone makes a barely accurate computer game on the Vietnam War that covers these issues, I probably will rage quit during the install. So anyway, there's another aspect. These forces, especially the non-regular ones, were more often than not rather small. As you can imagine, finding, tracking and gathering information on small units is rather difficult. Additionally, these small groups are very mobile and flexible, thus keeping track of them is also a problem. Which brings us to the next point, military operations. You probably guessed it, the communist forces were usually not engaging in conventional warfare. Usually they used hit-and-run tactics performed by small units, somewhere in the countryside. In general, most combat operations were below battalion size, whereas a battalion had roughly the size of 500 to 900 men. To give you some numbers on the combat operations from 1965 to 1972, the total number of ground assaults was around 12,000. Another 12,000 attacks were performed with indirect fire only. Then there were 72,000 harassments by fire and almost 59,000 other harassments. Political actions and coercions almost reached 21,000. And finally, anti-aircraft fire, around 50,000 attacks. As you can see, the percentage shows that the regular attacks were rather unconventional. Additionally, from the ground assaults, which made up only a small amount of all attacks, less than 5% were conducted by units larger than a battalion. Now a bit of explanation. The attacks by indirect fires meant 20 or more rounds were shot, whereas harassments was less than 20 rounds or fire from small arms. Such harassments were performed isolated without coordination with other units. They usually used a mortar and fired a few rounds and then retreated, yet on average for every 25 shots fired, they would kill an allied soldier or a civilian, whereas they usually suffered no losses themselves. To summarize, the war in Vietnam was confusing. Because there were no front lines, the force structure of the communist forces was very different from anything known to the US military. Additionally, the scale and type of the combat operations performed by the enemy was vastly different from what the US dealt in World War II or the war in Korea. Together this meant that the classic map with markers for units was not viable nor possible in Vietnam. Since such maps are a key tool on how to track progress in a war, there was one crucial element missing in the arsenal of US commanders and politicians. Now, special thanks to my Patreons who provided funds for the following book, which was used to create this video. As always, all sources are linked in the description. If you are interested in other videos about Vietnam, check out my Vietnam playlist. Or if you want to have a better understanding of the war in the Pacific, take a look at this video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.